All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Ezekiel Eason. I'll be presenting my speech, Youth and Outrage, the anti-war protests on CSU campuses, which will be focusing on my research item, the National Draft Card Turn-In poster, or as that's labeled in the Special Collections Archives at SJSU from the Art of Protest collection. All right. So the National Draft Card Turn-In poster. What is this item and why does it matter to us? So this item, as you can notice just simply by looking at it, it's not some highly made piece of art or some national treasure photograph. It is a poster that was taped on the side of a university building that was made by a piece of paper that was torn out of a binder, it looks like, or a spiral bound notebook, and used by a student to advertise their actions they're taking in protest of the Vietnam War. This is a very normal looking item, something that me or you or any student might just create as part of some club or as part of some action. And we would never expect that to become a remembered piece of history in a university library somewhere. But this is exactly what happened to this. And that, I believe, is the crux of why this item is important. It's normality. This is not something that was made by an artist or by a photographer or by a historian. This was just made by a student to show their passion and their drive to tell people what they wanted to be known and to have people take action against the systems that they believed were unfair. So which systems were unfair that they were trying to reach out against, that these normal students were willing to strike out against? This was the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was long, brutal. There's very little progress made by the Americans at all. National draft was used and had been used in previous wars, but was continued to be used during the Vietnam, which called up normal citizens who had no intention of serving and forced them to serve in the United States military. More importantly, though, and the reason why this was so widely this war was so widely resisted by the citizenry of the United States was that modern media, especially photographs and television, especially television, because it allowed for very raw, unedited images of the war to be shown in live time. You could see fights, attacks, what's going on in Vietnam happening more or less at the same moment it's happening in Vietnam in the US. You could be sitting at your TV watching stuff in Vietnam. Whereas even in World War II with photographs, things could take time, things could be edited, or photographs people didn't want to see be taken out of circulation. But with TV, there was no real way to censor it in time. So they could see the real war for what it was, and they could see, their sons, their brothers, living in horrible conditions. We've got some examples, photographs at the bottom here, pictures from the war. You can see young people. These people look our age, they're probably very young, 18 to maybe 20, 22 in these pictures. You can see them slugging through mud, walking through open fields, and wearing helmets that look too big. You can see the soldier in the middle, who's also not entirely in support of the war. And this is a fairly famous helmet writing, as it kind of shows that not even those who were drafted or who were sent to Vietnam were in support of the war. All right, the draft. So men age 18 to 26. So again, college age people are generally between like 18 or really generally between 17 and maybe 23, 24. So college age people were eligible to draft in the United States pretty much exclusively. By 1970, the sentiment among young people was really strong against the draft. So at that point, the war had been going on for over 10 years, and young people were no longer really willing to continue fighting. At first, it seemed like a major patriotic effort to stop communism, but as the war dragged on for so much time, for just years and years at this point, I believe it was over a decade at this point, There was no longer as much of a patriotic sentiment to fight the war. People no longer wanted to be called up to fight. They were no longer really willing to die for this effort. This is a sentiment that we brought up in seminar before, but this quote really, I think, sums up why young people are no longer willing to fight. They were tired of being forced into horrific circumstances not of their own making. So they felt that these wars were not something they chose to do. They were being forced to do these horrible things. And to emphasize this is a picture of a young soldier being treated for medical care after being wounded, actually several soldiers being treated by their medics and being transferred out of the war, kind of showing that these are the horrific circumstances that people were tired, these young people were tired of being forced into with the draft. In the top right, you can see a draft card. This was issued out in the later stages of the war, basically to mark eligible people with their draft status and their information if they were called up for the draft. During the draft period in the 1970s, you were required to carry this card and could, in fact, be liable to a fine or even a short period of jail time if you were caught without the card. If you were called up or maybe pulled over without this card, you could be liable for punishments by the law. With this, we get to our main topic, campus protests and where our object fits into this. So our object directly relates to a larger series of national strikes. These were held by the National Draft Card Coalition. This was a student-run major league organization which reached out to campuses across the United States to organize protests of various kinds. Both on our object, the National Draft Card Turn-In poster, all three kinds of their main protests are displayed. So here we see that on Monday there have in the building they labeled Quarry is a strike draft rally. This was a very common type of protest we even see today, which is people essentially going out and parading around the streets, chanting and holding signs against the protest. We see some examples of this in these pictures from SJSU protests. Here, these students, as you can see in the normal clothes, are protesting against the presence of Reserve Officer Training Corps or ROTC cadets on campus. ROTC is a program where students train in the military while doing college at their college campuses, and from there they then join the military after they graduate. So it's a way of getting your degree and joining the military. Obviously, during the war, they saw that many students saw this as kind of a abuse of campus resources and did not want this program on campus as they no longer supported the military or the war effort in general. And they saw this as kind of sending students to their deaths by having them train for the military or train students to kill, which they saw as unacceptable on campus. Then we see a draft teach-in is the next item on the draft cards roster. This is also very common, maybe a little bit less media centric, but a little less photogenic. But this was where they obviously teach students about the war, about the draft, about what's going on. And it's basically more educational time. So this would likely be inside more classroom, less likely marching out in the streets. And so this is a time to learn why the movement is happening. Why are people turning in their draft cards? Why are people draft dodging? And this is a very educational time. So very important. Again, and this was a lot more about spreading kind of intellectual knowledge rather than kind of doing mass movements or protests. Then the last item on Wednesday at 1:30 at the Crown Building, we see draft card turn-in. Now, this is a very interesting event. A draft card turn-in was also known as a draft card burning. And essentially, this is where they would turn in those required draft cards, which they had to hold, and in an act of protest. The NDCC actually had a table in the student unit SJSU from which they would collect draft cards. And then occasionally they would go out with all the draft cards they collected and they would burn them as a symbol of resistance against the draft. And so students and anyone who wanted to turn their draft card, anyone who was age could go to student union, but mostly SJSU students would go to student union, turn in their draft cards as a sign of protest. And then the NDCC representatives would take that and hold these draft card burning protests occasionally. So again, we saw while this poster is not from SJSU originally. It is from a nearby school at UCSC, where many similar activities are happening. These same activities, this poster was very representative of the types of activities that were happening at the time with the strikes, the teach-ins, and draft card turn-ins. All three of these things were happening at SJSU as well. However, this exact poster is not from our school. Now, there was danger behind taking part of these actions. Obviously, famously, strikes are broken up by police and sometimes National Guards members and could be harmful to the students. But draft card turn-ins were also very potentially dangerous because if you were caught without your draft card, you could be liable to a fairly expensive fine, especially at the time, and or several years in jail. So it was these students had to be very passionate about their cause of resisting the draft in order to risk these punishments just by giving up a piece of paper, right? So they had to take this action knowing that if it could backfire greatly on them. I think this really just shows the passion the students were willing to have for their movement, but they were willing to not only just do these actions, but they were advertising, they were encouraging other people to come out and do these actions, publicly drawing posters, putting them up, basically advertising these illegal actions, saying that, we don't care what the punishment might be, we have to essentially stop what's going on so that we can be safer. Some statistics we have on the draft are the total military numbers for draft versus volunteer is that 25% of the Vietnam era military was drafted versus volunteer. So 25% of the military overall was draftees. Slightly more alarming though is with only 25% of the military being draftees, combat deaths, draftees represented a larger number of that with 30.4% of combat deaths being draftees. So a larger percentage than the overall military. So draftees were were essentially more likely to die than other military members per capita. So that is a very concerning draft number. And overall, around 17,000 draftees were killed during the Vietnam War, which is, again, understandable why these students would be very up in arms about being forced to join a military that had a fairly high chance, almost a 1 in 3 chance of you getting killed if you're sent to combat. So it was very, very concerning. Some final notes about this object. Just looking at the way it's crafted, the symbol here, we see a peace sign, which was very much popularized during the war, during the Vietnam War, especially the protests in the protests against it. We see that this sign develops the kind of peace. The reason it's called the peace sign is it was representative of ending the war. And now it's obviously a very well-known symbol. It was developed in an anti-Vietnam War bring peace sentiment. This encapsulates this woman with long red hair. There's no real, this is not a well-known symbol as such as the peace sign, but some speculation that could go into what this represents could be kind of the bleeding, the bloodshed behind the draft that people are losing their lives. It could be kind of how as we see the face trapped in the peace sign, can be seen like the almost trapped feeling of the students in this draft situation. There could be a lot of reasons behind this, but of course, this not being a nationally recognized symbol like the peace sign or something that was used commonly, anything that we do is speculation. That what this student meant with this symbol could be many things, but again, I feel very like with the bright reds and the trapped in the peace sign, it likely represents the students feeling that they're trapped into this kind of cycle of bloodshed, and they want to escape that with that peace, right? This very normal looking, poster is just very representative of how these students felt. They felt trapped. They felt like they had to strike out. They had to, take paper from their notebooks and do what they could to stop this horrible system they were stuck in. And I think that's very reflective on us today as well, because as we know, with the war in Ukraine and with many wars that have happened recently, there's always been talks in the media about maybe they will restart the draft, and I think this shows that just like these students in the 60s, we need to take, if this were to happen again, we would need to take effort to, use what we can use to make sure that our fellow students aren't killed by a system that isn't fair, that makes people, that forces people to do things that they don't want to do. That this could be us, right? This is not a certain object that's far removed. This is not something that we couldn't touch or make. This is the exact sort of thing that our actions could be representative in. All right. All right, so this concludes my presentation on the National Draft Card Turn-In poster and what it means in the overall anti-Vietnam War protest era and how it could affect us today and how this represents us as students in a potentially similar situation should that ever happen. Here are my resources. They didn't copy it over well from the outline document, but these are all the books, news articles, original sources I used, and a lot of sources of my pictures. All right, this concludes my presentation. Thank you.